You know, one of the sub-stories of the federal parity law, which we often don't talk about, is the fact that the law was designed to really have a lot of the implementation occur at the state level. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Clement, who's also the Senior Policy Advisor at the Kennedy Forum. He got a Master's of Public Health from Drexel University, and he's been the main architect behind Parity Track. So it's my pleasure to have him give us a little bit of an update as to everything that's going on in the States, which obviously is a pretty big landscape. Tim.
Thank you, Gary. Let me just take a look at this. All right, so I'm going to do everyone the great disservice of reading what's highlighted on the screen right here. If there's any children in the room, please cover their ears. Okay. Non-quantitative treatment limitations. General rule. A group health plan or health insurance coverage may not impose a non-quantitative treatment limitation with respect to mental health or substance use disorder benefits in any classification unless under the terms of the plan or health insurance coverage as written in operation, any processes, strategies, evidentiary standards, or other factors used in applying the non-quantitative treatment limitation to mental health or substance use disorder benefits in the classification are comparable to and applied no more stringently than the processes, strategies, evidentiary standards, or other factors used in applying the limitation with respect to medical surgical benefits in the classification. It's pretty simple stuff there. If anyone in this room who's never seen that before understands what that says right off the bat, I will recommend you for a MacArthur Genius Grant, because it took me several dozen, if not hundreds of times of reading that before I understood what that meant. But I do understand what that means now. So I just want to point that out just to demonstrate the complexity of, let me just get this off the screen so no one hurts their eyes. Just to demonstrate the complexity of this law, and it's a very dense law. Those are the final regulations that were issued in 2013. And then another thing that adds complexity to this as well, that I think that it's who's responsible for enforcing your health insurance. Who's responsible for parity enforcement? Is it the Department of Labor? It could be your state insurance department, state Medicaid office. Could even be the Center for Consumer Information or Insurance Oversight within Department of Health and Human Services. Some states it even could be your state treasurer for state government employees. I mean, I think the question is, boy, this is all so complicated, and why is that? As a very wise man once said, nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated. So it is complicated, and I don't say this to discourage anyone. Just because something's complicated doesn't mean we can't do it. I mean, I don't think this is more complicated than, say, taking a man from the planet Earth and having that man then go walk on the moon. And just as Patrick's uncle said in 1961, before this decade is over, we will send a man and have him walk on the moon. And they pulled that off. It's been longer than that now. Since this law was signed, and then we don't have compliance. So if we can put a man on the moon, I think we can come into compliance with this law. So anyway, I'll get off the soapbox for a minute here. I'll just give you some background on what we've done. So paritytrack.org, which is up on the screen, these are our parity reports, our state reports. Oops, legislative overview, no, Arizona. You don't want to look at Arizona. They're terrible. Sorry, I'm sorry. In terms of what? No. See, so in terms of oversight and enforcement, it's not a good picture out there. So the way Parity Track came into existence is I met Patrick in 2014, and somehow a few months later, I was at his house on his back porch. His wife Amy made us crab cakes. They were delicious. And he said, "Tim, how is parity being implemented throughout the country?" And I'm like, "I don't know. There's no website called paritytrack.org tracking that." So he told us to go about and get that done, get a website that tracks how parity is being implemented, both in terms of legislative actions to further implement the law, and then also in terms of regulatory actions, in terms of state insurance departments and what they're doing to enforce the law, to implement the law. So we did that. And so if you go into paritytrack.org, and we have a map, we have our legislative map. You can click on your state and see what's been going on. Take a look at. Take Maryland, just because I know that's completely up to date because I did it last week. And you go onto states, and it should give you if it loads. Maybe it won't load. There we go. Well, it's Pennsylvania. We'll go to Pennsylvania. So it has, updates on, you have your legislation that's been signed into law that furthers parity. Then you have your introduced legislation. We just give brief summaries of that, and there's links to all the bills in question. You can click on them and show you what's going on. Then we also have, back on our map page. Whoops, that's what I want to click on. There we go. So we have our legislative map, we have our regulatory map as well. And so then, you can click on a state and see what they've been doing to implement the law in terms of enforcement actions. So you can take a look at Illinois, since that's where we are right now. So it has actions like things that have been issued by departments like bulletins or consumer education campaigns and things like that. So that's what we have in Parity Track. We're a little bit out of date on Parity Track. We still need to fill it in with 2017 information, but that's something we're working on right now, and we're very confident we'll have that up to date pretty soon. But that's the thing when it comes to parity in the states. If you want to know what's been going on throughout the country in terms of parity actions, you just go to Parity Track and click on your state, and it gives a pretty good overview of what's been happening. So moving on from that, some of the work that's been going on in the states is, as I mentioned, these non-quantitative treatment limitations and how complicated they are. A lot of states in the last 2 years or so, and several states before that, have been moving fairly proactively and aggressively to start moving towards enforcement of these non-quantitative treatment limitations and determining if they are in compliance or not. A number of states applied for and received a grant from CMS in 2016. 19 states and District of Columbia received that grant. If you want to know all of those states, please talk to me offline. I'll give you a list of the states. So one of the main focuses of those grants is doing enforcement related to non-quantitative treatment limitations. And one thing that we decided to do, and by we, I mean myself and my friends at the American Psychiatric Association and the Parity Implementation Coalition, which Henry is a part of, we decided that we would create a guide that would help state regulators and, of course, federal regulators could use it too for non-quantitative treatment limitations. I think you all have it on your, right in front of you. It's the 6-step Parity Compliance Guide for Non-Quantitative Treatment Limitation Requirements. You can find that on Parity Track as well. It's on our resources page. We have a special drop down for it. It's the Anyway, so our 6-step compliance guide, what we did is, as I mentioned to you earlier, those very complex terms, processes, strategies, evidentiary standards, or other factors. What we do in this guide is we create, if you turn to page 2, we have a 6-step process for how plans or issuers could take that information and demonstrate how it is that they are compliant and how it is they are designing and applying the benefits in a way that is comparable and no more stringently applied for all of those terms, such as your factors and your evidentiary standards that might define the factors, and then your processes, strategies, both as written and in operation. And that's one thing that's very important to consider, is that the law has a very clear bifurcation between compliance with non-quantitative treatment limitations, both as written, your written plan documents, whether that be your summary of benefits or maybe the utilization review manual that the utilization reviewers do when they determine whether your care is medically necessary. And there's also an in-operation component where, how do plans, when they're determining if something's medically necessary, if they're going to cover it or not, well, how are they doing that? Is it comparable in a way as they're making decisions and the discretion they're using when they make those same decisions for medical and surgical care? And I got to tell you, unless the plan does a self-audit of how it is that how they're applying those benefits in operation for medical and surgical, how they're doing it for behavioral, there's no possible way you could ever know that, which is why just looking at plan documents is never going to be sufficient to determine whether or not there actually is compliance. So we created this guide to help regulators. It's something that, we have a spreadsheet that goes along with it that has a list of 19 different NQTLs that you could possibly go through these 6 steps. The 6 steps have been adapted for each one of those NQTLs. We would never, by any stretch of the imagination, suggest that a regulator ask a planner or issuer to fill out the entire spreadsheet. We would just suggest that you use maybe 2 or 3 NQTLs and have the planner issuer fill out the spreadsheet for just those 2 or 3, like prior authorization, step therapy, something like that. So anyway, we've been working with states, and I can't tell you which states we've been in conversations with. We've been in conversations with a number of states to help them use this guide, to use this as part of market conduct examinations they might be doing on health plans and issuers in terms of how they're designing and applying their NQTLs, and also prospectively in terms as part of the form filing process. So we're working with a number of states. We think we'll be working with a few more states as the year goes on. But we know that there is, as challenging as this may seem and as frustrated as everyone may be, there hasn't been the progress we'd like to see. I do feel very confident that, that states are moving in the right direction, just as the Department of Labor is moving in the right direction. Just from some of the states I've talked to and some of the conversations I've had and some of the things that I've seen, I do feel confident that we're going in the right direction. And as long as we understand that those are complex terms that I just mentioned at the beginning, they're not impossible terms to understand. And one thing that I would caution is sometimes I hear people say, well, the law is not clear on this or it's vague on that. I don't know if that's really true. I think people shouldn't confuse density for ambiguity. And then one other thing we're doing at the state level is this is also something you all have on your seats. We have model legislation. It's just this used to be much longer document, our model legislation. What I realized though last year as we started working in a number of states, and you can talk to me offline as to which states we've been working on, what we did is we trimmed down our model legislation, so it's really just focused on embedding the six-step process into state codes, and also making sure that state insurance departments are doing the necessary steps they need to take to bring plans and issuers into compliance, and also requiring some transparency for state regulatory agencies. What exactly is it that you're doing? Because we found that from what we've seen with our parity track work is that when state legislatures require state regulators to report back to the public as to what it is they're doing to check for compliance, like that, suddenly the state regulators start doing a lot more because they don't want to issue a report saying that we're not doing anything. So that's something we've been doing. And again, we're in a number of states. We're expanding a lot more states. We've been partnering with a lot of our national advocacy organization friends, like the National Alliance of Mental Illness, Mental Health America, the National Council, American Society of Addiction Medicine, both APAs, the American Medical Association, Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, Community Catalyst. There's a lot of organizations that are in it together with us, this model legislation, working in the states. That's something that we see that while it's been a decade and we're not where we want to be, I think we're really moving towards the right direction to where we want to be. And I think that while, yes, there's been frustration, I think there's been a lot of progress, and I think there's more progress to come. So, I don't want to go over time, so I'll stop there if anyone has any questions.
I'm so glad you started your presentation with highlighting the complexity of this. Because when I first read that, I was dumbfounded also. And it took me probably at least 100 times myself to kind of figure out exactly what they were talking about. But I have a couple of questions. The first is, Illinois had to, health plans in Illinois had to complete the analysis, submit it to the Medicaid plans in particular, had to submit it to our State Department of Health Care and Family Services, our Medicaid authority, and with the understanding they are submitting that to the feds. So what is CMS doing when they collect all this information? Are they collecting it from all states, and what are they going to do with that? That's one question. You want them?
Yeah, I'll answer. So,
okay.
My relationship with CMS isn't necessarily as close as it would say the Department of Labor, but I do believe that they're going to go over those reports, give a seal of approval where warranted, and maybe report back to some states where there might need to be some improvements. But I don't know that there's going to be much more after those reports are submitted that you're going to see happening. I mean, that's the best answer
But
I
that's
can
kind
give
of
you.
sad, right? They're collecting all this information and then, okay.
Well,
Um,
not everything's going to make you smile. So.
Okay. And the second question is, the health plans, most often use proprietary clinical decision support tools. And their departments will just basically take these tools and their nurses will follow that criteria.
Right.
So to what extent are we able to work and evaluate parity in those tools? Because that's what the plans are using.
In terms of, to what extent do you have access to them, even though they may be proprietary? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, obviously they're proprietary, but they're the one, that's the foundation under which clinical decisions are made.
Right.
So if there are going to be violations in parity, they're going to be because there are violations in those tools.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, an analysis of those tools, in terms of, what is medically necessary, what is medically appropriate, those tools they have for mental health and substance use disorder, how do they compare to the tools for medical and surgical? And you need to be
Correct.
able to look at them and compare. And also, how are they designed, too?
Exactly.
It's not just what does it look like on the piece, just because the words might be the same on the piece of paper, how do they come to those words in terms of, the panel of experts they brought together to put together those tools? How do they select this material versus that material? Okay, we're using ASAM criteria for this, but then we're using interqual for that. Like, well, how did you make that determination? What level of discretion was involved, and how does that compare to how you're doing it in the medical and surgical side? And that's something that I've yet to see an analysis of that be submitted. So that's definitely an area where we need to move into.
Yeah, and even working with, the owners of those tools to push them to create parity.
Right, and that's a
Yeah.
key thing. There's a lot of different players involved in coming to parity.
Let me ask, Tim, let me ask you a question. What's an example? Can you give a couple examples of states that are actually doing a good job, or like kind of the top in terms, and maybe some attributes of what they're doing that's making a difference?
Sure. So the California's Department of Managed Healthcare, they've been doing a great job for a number of years, and they've been asking for all of this information that we would need to determine compliance. And as they've learned over the years, that they might have asked for too much information without enough specificity. But California's Department of Managed Healthcare, they're doing a fantastic job. I know that Pennsylvania's insurance department right now is really doing a great job. Maryland's insurance administration, I think they're moving really well in the right direction. I think that Minnesota, I think they're starting to move in the right direction. Connecticut, they've been doing a pretty good job for a while. I think those are some of the leading states we've seen. Rhode Island is a state that's been doing a good job. And when I say every state's been doing a good job, there's still a lot of room for improvement for even in a state like California and their Department of Managed Healthcare. And I should be clear, in California, you have your Department of Managed Healthcare, then you also have the California Department of Insurance. It's a strange market out there.
Any other questions? No,
Hi there. I am from Minnesota,
Oh, great.
and I'm work within the Department of Commerce, which houses the insurance division, the regulator for the state-regulated plans. And like the lady that just spoke, I've been reading the parity laws. I'm a 25-plus year veteran of health insurance and now work for the state to help enforce the parity rules. And federal law is complex, and even our state laws, which
Sure.
were in place 10 years before the national parity law, and we're the home of Paul Wellstone.
Yep.
And then we have United Healthcare in the same state, and so the frustrations about all of that. So, a couple things. It seems sort of obvious that if we ask the plans for proof, they're always going to say, we did it. That's just a general comment there.
Right.
And so that speaks to needing to do something more specific with claims and really look at them,
Well, I mean, yeah,
rather than asking someone, did you comply?
you're right. I mean, rarely. I mean, a lot of states have check boxes where you check off, are you in compliance with,
Correct.
45 CFR 146.136, and no one's going to say no. So
Right.
what we want is, okay, you did it. Let's see it. What is it, and how does it relate to those very specific terms, like processes in operation? How are you doing clinical peer review during concurrent review? What does that look like? How have you determined that's comparable to and no more stringently applied than how you do it for medical and surgical
Yep.
care? So there's a lot to what is the it. We
Right.
think that this tool we have helps get at the it.
Great. So personally, as I've been working on this with my boss, who is a very bright person and an actuary, is how do we get to what is the comparable medical case or the comparable medical diagnosis that we can compare? I think that's kind of where we're
Well-
getting sort of stalled out, because one example is rehabilitative care. Now, there are tons of rehabilitative care facilities in Minnesota that vie for a patient on the medical side. And we don't have enough of them on the residential side for mental health. And mental health residential treatment is not even covered for adults. So what is the comparable physical problem compared to mental health for residential treatment? Because it's obvious that many patients on the medical side need transition of care. They don't just go from hospital to home, or they don't go from hospital to outpatient. They need to be somewhere else for several months or whatever it takes. And what is the comparable medical
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean,
comparison?
that's something that
So
people.
if anybody knows that, I'd love to hear that.
Well, let me just weigh in before Henry does. So residential treatment, I would caution against looking to compare condition to condition, because the law is really more about comparing classification of benefit to classification of benefit. So how is it that, so residential treatment, if that's within the inpatient, let's say we're talking in-network. So residential treatment, inpatient, in-network. Okay, so if that's not covered at all, if that's excluded entirely from the inpatient in-network benefit, that's an NQTL. So how is that determined that that's not going to be covered, and how does that compare to other facilities you do on the medical and surgical side for how you make that comparison? And then when in terms of whether it's determining whether care is appropriate or not, again, it's the comparison between, just generally speaking, the inpatient in-network side, how are you determining whether or not it is medically necessary to have somebody be in an inpatient in-network facility for medical and surgical, and how does that compare to how you're doing it for residential, which would fall in the inpatient in-network classification? So it's a broad comparison. I would caution against going condition to condition and just look at it within those 6 classifications of benefits in terms of making the determination as to whether, to making that comparison in terms of comparability and equivalent stringency.
I would agree with Tim. Typically, if it's, let's say, a medical rehab facility, there would be multiple diagnoses that would classify a person that might need that level of care. And the same is true like on a psychiatric residential or substance abuse residential. They might be multiple categories of diseases. But that would be a violation if they exclude a residential level of care for psych and mental health problems, because that was clarified in these regs, or the good part. That would be, quote, NQTL, or medical management violation. And there are some adult residential treatment centers, there are for kids for mental health and for adults, and not many. And one of the reasons they're not many is they're not paid for. Okay, one of the things we didn't talk about is why there is a shortage. Well, if you don't pay, or you have to fight to get paid, which it sounds like even with the parity law in effect for 10 years, they're still not paying, the providers are not going to set it up. Whether it's no matter whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, a nonprofit can't survive either without. So this is a big problem that those of us who have been in this field a long time. This is particularly true in the new technology area. In one of the meetings we had with the Kennedy Forum on new technologies, one of the device manufacturers that's come up with a transcranial magnetic stimulation for treatment-resistant depression, he gave a very depressing history, okay? He said, we spent $50 million developing this device to treat treatment-resistant depression. God knows we need new treatments in this field, right? He said, we spent $50 million getting from the inception to FDA approval, 6 randomized trials, a specific code, CPT code, and APA recommendation of best practice. Once we got that, in the medical world, we'd be covered. In the behavioral world, we have spent another $100 million in 5 years trying to get full reimbursement. Now, the investors in that room were looking like, I don't think I'm going to invest in this field, okay? Because why would you? So this is a problem. I don't care, again, nonprofit or for-profit. If you can't get the rules clear, people are not going to set the programs up.
And before I step down, Patrick asked me, just one thing I want to mention, there's a new project that's been launched called the Parity at 10 project, which is working with a number of states, Illinois included. It's a partnership between the Legal Action Center, which is leading it, the Kennedy Forum Partnership for Drug-Free Kids, TRI, CASA. So it's something that we're taking a really fine-tooth comb through the histories of those 5 states. The first 5 states we're working on are Illinois, Ohio, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. So that's a project that's underway, and I think we're going to have some great work that comes out of that. Parity at, like the @ sign, 10. It's to symbolize it's been 10 years since the law signed.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things to answer the questions, I think, in terms of regulation is we definitely need support the regulator community in terms of creating a standardized market conduct exam. So my opinion is that there's not been really since the NIC adopted the Utilization Management Act in the early 1990s and URAC and NCQA, there's really been no fundamental upgrade of those regulations. I think MAPIA provides an opportunity and a window to really kind of update the market conduct exam so we can come up with those kind of testing protocols, much like insurance regulators do for solvency or testing for marketing. So it's my pleasure next to introduce the next 2 speakers that are going to be talking about accreditation. Most of you don't know this, but for the past 10 months, there's been an incredible committee made up of all the stakeholders, again, the industry, providers, consumers, and others, in terms of really trying to come up with more fidelity in terms of how the federal and applicable state parity laws are implemented. So it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Reisman, who's the president of Clear Health Quality Institute. Prior to that, he was very well known in his role as a civil prosecutor for the New York Attorney General's office and probably did more on parity enforcement at that block of time than anybody else in the country. So he's got a great experience as a regulator. And then Brad Lerner, who's the associate assistant counsel at Beacon Health Solutions, who was actually, when I joined the Kennedy Forum, one of my early mentors who taught me a lot about what was going on. So Brad and Michael, come on up. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to the Kennedy Forum for making accreditation part of this program this morning. You know, I was just thinking the last time I spoke at the Kennedy Forum was in balmy Boston in June of 2015. That was the first time I, of course, met Patrick. I met Gary for the first time, and I was, at that time, a civil prosecutor at the New York AG's office. And lo and behold, almost 3 years later, I'm now working on what I think is a really fantastic project to develop the first focused, detailed set of accreditation standards for mental health and addiction parity in the country. You know, I also just wanted to acknowledge all the fantastic speakers who preceded us, the Hooties. I mean, I had the honor of speaking with each of you last night at dinner, and you know, sharing, you shared your experiences, I shared some of mine, and I mean, this is why we're here, right? This is exactly why we're here. I also want to acknowledge Henry, who I also met for the first time 3 years ago at the Kennedy Forum, because I was on a panel that Henry chaired, and Henry is, I mean, everything that has been said so far about Henry is true. I received my most recent email from Henry 19 minutes ago. It's amazing. I'm like, oh my God, I got more homework. Okay. I also want to, of course, acknowledge Amy Turner from DOL. As a former government person, I know how challenging it is to be in the position that you're in, and people are looking to you, and you have, the various, camps that sometimes are, diametrically opposed to each other. Who did I leave out in terms of speakers? Tim, I think that the work that the Kennedy Forum is doing on Parity Track, of course, is fantastic, and I think to segue into accreditation. I think the 6 steps is an important tool. It's an important framework. I think what we're about here with this accreditation program is drilling down even more to answer some of the questions that folks in the audience have posed this morning, because that's really what we're trying to understand. How can a regulator really dig into these questions? Because that was the challenge for me in the state of New York for half a decade, and there's been a lot of guidance, a lot of examples so far, but we're trying to put this all together with our Parity accreditation. I want to acknowledge also, of course, Brad Lerner, who's sitting next to me. He is the co-chair of our Parity Standards Committee, along with Connie Galetti from the American Psychological Association. I click the green button, right? There are 2 green buttons here. One is, looks like okay, the big one. Okay, all right. So the question is why? Why are we here? Well, accreditation, it's interesting. I could talk a lot about accreditation, but I won't, thankfully. But I will say I am a skeptic when it comes to accreditation. I know probably many people in this room are also skeptics when it comes to accreditation, because before I became a lawyer, both in private practice and in public service, I was a mental health counselor for 10 years. And I worked at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where I'm from, for half a decade. And you could tell when an accreditation survey was coming, we called them JACO back then, Joint Commission. You could tell when they were coming, because every day for weeks and weeks on end, every surface was scrubbed, polished, painted. There were people with Bellevue ID tags I had never seen before, right? They just came out of the woodwork to get the place into shape. And so, that led me to be skeptical about accreditation, and it's kind of a private entity coming in and saying, okay, we're going to give you this, seal of approval. But obviously, the challenge is to develop a set of standards that are meaningful, that are realistic, and that don't preordain the outcome that you're going to pass if you apply, right? So what we're trying to achieve is a tool in the toolbox, right? We're not trying to displace any other form of regulation or litigation for that matter, but we are trying to protect consumers by promoting compliance with MPIA and best practices. We're also trying to assist insurers, plans, and benefit administrators by creating a uniform set of national standards and a process for assessing parity. And really, it's about the process. It's not about a conclusion as to compliance with the law. That is something we can't do. Frankly, I think it's really beyond the scope of any accrediting body. Now, there are some instances in which under federal or state law, there are requirements for accreditation under the Affordable Care Act, for example. Independent review organizations that handle external appeals must be accredited by a nationally recognized body. Most states have such laws, but we're not giving the legal thumbs up or thumbs down to anybody. We're also trying to assist insurers and benefits administrators in preparing for the audits and market conduct exams that we know are coming, based on what you've heard so far this morning, so that they know what to expect and that they have their answers ready. We're ultimately going to provide an independent third party's informed assessment as to whether a plan's processes have been conducted appropriately, whether they've really gone through the way that they should, the analyses that need to happen, and that they've implemented internal compliance controls, including vendor oversight. Of course, that's very important. Many plans outsource, lots of their benefit administration for both medical as well as behavioral health and SUD. So that's an important part of parity and accreditation.
Hey, so I'm speak up. I'll introduce myself again, Brad Lerner from Beacon. I'm working for a health plan, and I really appreciate this opportunity to address you all on accreditation. I think one of the things that I just want to start at the outset is I've been involved with Patrick and some of the work here for quite some time, and this effort that we're doing here, which is bringing all the stakeholders together, and we are working very hard on this, is trying to answer the questions that were raised, to try and address some of the shortfalls that we're seeing, to try and be able to understand the density and complexity and every adjective that's used here. I think there are gaps in the guidance, and that was maybe purposely so, but those gaps are creating a lot of struggles because different people will interpret things differently. So I think that this is a positive development, and so I think that getting, you know, all the major insurers are participating in this, all of them, and we are trying to focus on, you know, having really the harder conversations that a piece of paper, that long guidance, to try and understand, you know, hey, what are the limitations of what information exists? How do we best format it so consumers can understand it? So I think at a high level, you know, this is an important effort. And just on a personal note, you know, Michael and I worked when he was the Attorney General, he was the regulator, and now here we are working together on this project. So life always comes full circle. So.
In fact, I think I was wearing this very same suit the very first time that Brad and I met. Do you remember? No, just kidding. But Brad, I did want to ask you, because I think it's important for folks to hear, to give you the opportunity to speak a little about, you know, what are some of the challenges, the big challenges that insurers and MBHOs like Beacon face in complying with parity?
Yeah, so I think that is a great question, because, you know, we're looking at that term that Tim highlighted, the processes, strategies, evidentiary standards, and we're trying to understand, you know, these are not defined terms in the law, and we're trying to understand what information. So now we're no longer at the high. This is the wonky part that people are talking about. It's very easy to say, well, just get this information, put it in a usable format, disclose it, and put it out there. But in terms of really understanding, well, what are the unique qualities of mental health? What is, you know, how is it that we can define these things in a way that makes sense? You know, you know, ERISA took a long time to get off the ground. This is taking a longer time to get off the ground, but it's not through lack of thought. And then the other issue we're having is just the disparate interpretations. In Minnesota, we can have a different interpretation than Illinois, have a different interpretation in New York. So, you know, we're just trying to also figure out, you know, from, you know, what is, and that's what I think accreditation is so important, is to just try and, you know, get a framework. So, you know, if this is what the law is and you have to do X, Y, and Z, we will do it. But right now, that's still like, what is the exact answers? And, you know, I would say to Tim, you know, when he's like, well, density is not complexity. I'm like, no, complexity is complexity. So we are struggling with some of these definitions that are in these laws to know exactly how deep the information needs to go and what's useful to consumers.
Great. Well, just one other reason why we're doing this. We're trying to provide guidance ultimately to the regulators, right? And we've been engaged in conversations over the last few months with folks at DOL, HHS, with some of the more prominent, I should say more active parity state regulators, including the Department of Managed Healthcare in California. So to talk about our process, and Brad mentioned that we have a committee, a standards committee. We have 22 people on the committee. It's comprised of representatives from the 6 biggest insurance companies in the country, plus Beacon, which is, I believe, the largest managed behavioral health organization in the country. And also many of the most prominent parity advocates in the country, and provider representatives as well. And I think it's fair to say these are, you know, the industry and provider slash advocate groups have not seen eye to eye over the years on very many things. But what we have learned over almost a year, it actually started thanks to Gary before I joined Clear Health Quality Institute. What we've learned is that when you get folks either in a room or on a phone call, and we've had, you know, probably, 15 full committee meetings, and including 2 all-day in-person meetings in DC. What we've learned is that when you get people talking, listening to each other, that's when change happens. That's when you can actually drill down on what's really important. Now, that's not to say folks are giving up any strong issues or positions that they have, but I think we are getting closer to achieving, I hope, consensus on these standards. And I will say one area I think in which we've made a lot of progress, and this is getting into the wonkiness of parity, that one of those 4 terms that Tim mentioned is factors. The factors have to be comparable and no more stringent. And then, in my opinion, the 5 most important words in the regulation are as written and in operation. And so we've been, parsing out what those mean in practice, like actually getting into, what does a plan have to do? And one area I think we've made a lot of progress on, and it may not sound like much, but if you're, Henry's been doing this a lot longer than I have, but, I think over the years, plans have pointed to a list of health economics factors that they think about or consider or, chew on when they are deciding whether or not to impose NQTLs. And I think it comes from Richard Frank from an article in 1985. I actually looked it up on the internet, but it's in various guidance documents and reports that have been issued, this list of factors. And that's all some of the plans have done in the past, just pointed, they've said, okay, we look at these 7 factors on both sides of the ledger, therefore we are complying with the regulation. And again, it may not sound like a huge victory, but what we have really achieved consensus on is that's not sufficient. You have to drill down and show the work that goes into the analyses of each of those factors. And the reality of the situation is that some of the factors, like cost variability, high cost growth, those, frankly, in our healthcare system right now, those are the ones that, across the board, are the subject of the most focus. So, that's where we're really spending a lot of time now in drilling down on what do those mean? How do you measure those? We know that they're measured. Look, this country spends twice as much as any other industrialized country, or any country in the world for that matter, on healthcare. We do not have better outcomes. We're all concerned about cost. And so, that's something where I think this is the the NQTL that has a quantitative element, right? This is where the nomenclature gets all really wonky, right? So I think for a long period of time, there's been resistance to looking at, numerical parts of NQTLs, but we believe that that's the way forward. So we're trying to fill in gaps. We're adhering to the regulations in terms of trying to encompass both the DOL regulations as well as the CMS Medicaid parity regulations, looking to them to answer particular questions. We're focused on QTLs, NQTLs, and disclosures, and really people are exchanging their views. In terms of the future, in 2018, we are working on detailed examples of NQTL analyses. This is really getting into the weeds. In particular, prior authorization, network adequacy, which also relates, of course, to network admission standards and reimbursement. And we're looking very closely at the Milliman research, the other study that Henry mentioned by Tammy Mark and her colleagues, as well as other ways of that we know health plans look at these issues, how they look at these issues, whether it's time and distance standards or provider to enrollee ratios. Now they may have that on paper, every health plan does, but how do they actually monitor that they're meeting those standards? And then experimental treatment exclusions, and that relates to the issue that I keep saying Henry, but he's mentioned all these things this morning, the exclusion in particular of something like TMS. We're working towards consensus. We hope in the next couple of months we'll achieve that in a preliminary way, which will enable us to go into a public comment period and beta testing with a couple of applicants. Then we are going to have another review. This standards committee will remain in existence, of course, to vet the findings of the public comment and the beta testing, and then we hope to launch the program at some point this year, or in the first half of this year to be specific. But we also recognize that the law changes, regulations change. There's going to be new guidance issued by the federal agencies, and we will take all of that into consideration. It's not about creating a set of standards that are frozen in time and saying, okay, we're done. We realize that the version that gets launched, that's 1.0. There's going to be a 2.0, 3.0, et cetera, and ongoing evaluation and improvement. So that's the accreditation story. So do we have time for any questions?
Hi, I'm Renee Popovits. I had a quick question. A lot of the insurance companies already are accredited by NCQA or URAC, and NCQA has standards on denials and on appropriate member appeals and all of the kinds of things that we heard the stories about. And so I'm kind of curious how this accreditation is going to help, or if we should be looking at some of the existing accreditations that the departments of insurance, have these companies comply, they're supposed to comply with. What will this new accreditation do?
Yeah, Renee, that's a great question. So there are some rudimentary, I would say, and sort of bare bones, and it's maybe like a page or two. As you can tell just from the density of the law that this is comprehensive, meaning we are actually in a room with all of the stakeholders, actually walking through examples of how a consumer, what do you have to show that a pre-authorization in an inpatient category, what is the process, what are the factors, what are the evidentiary standards, what would be enough, and then coming up with conclusions and sort of breaking it down, systematically like the law sets forth. So it'd be comparing like a very cursory, like one-page check to like its own module, it's its own world. In a Venn diagram, it's like off into itself. So it doesn't fit neatly into sort of like a lot of accreditations. There are desk audits, the NCQA and URAC, they come to these service centers, but they would never be able, this is so specialized, so in-depth, the law is so unique in terms of the objective and subjective, in terms of the review, the sort of open-ended proofs. So we are filling in some gaps there. So hopefully this will provide a rigor, because remember, particularly as I speak to this group, we have the APA, we have the Parity Implementation Coalition, we have the Legal Action Center. I mean, they're not going to want to see something that's going to be cursory or watered down in any way. They have, your interests, we have your interests in many ways to try and make things better. And so, it's important that this be as comprehensive as possible.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on, Michael, one of your prefacing comments and perhaps be a bit provocative, but why shouldn't we be skeptical of an accreditation organization? From many people's standpoint, they're, funded by the industry. The boards are dominated by the industry and directed by the industry. And in our experience in California, speaking of NCQA, we had the experience of bringing a complaint to the state regulator, and the regulator, their investigators found that the state's largest health plan had denied patients with mental health and substance use disorders of realizing appointments within regulated timeframes. But on a massive basis, 50% of patients were not granted timely appointments. But at the same time, NCQA issued this health plan an A grading, their top rating. But so I guess the question is, why shouldn't we be skeptical of a new accreditation organization?
Great question. Well, I would challenge you on one fact. I mean, our boards are not dominated by industry, right? So I think that's probably unique, in particular the Parity Accreditation Committee. I believe that the other accreditation bodies have consumer representatives on some of their committees, but not to the extent that we do. I think that's a first really important check. And as Brad mentioned, we could not develop standards in 2 months or 3 months. I think initially we had an idea that it was going to be much quicker than it has turned out to be. But I think more importantly, perhaps on a substantive level, I am involved in this project, and folks like Gary who are involved in this project, and we see from our perspective the mistakes that other accrediting bodies have made. And the litigation or the enforcement actions against accredited entities in New York and California that have been announced over the last few months, and I think there was a lawsuit filed last week against Centene in Washington State, which actually followed on from a Washington Insurance Commissioner enforcement action on general network adequacy. I don't think it was specific to parity, but we see those mistakes, and we're trying to learn from them.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, nothing the accreditation does oversees the law. So we could put all the stamps on anything and be like, this is parity compliant. You just go right to Amy and she could be like, I don't care that there's a stamp on here. I'm going to do my own independent. So this is more to help everybody, not just plans, but to help everybody fill in the gaps and to have sort of a uniform system and to maybe look when Minnesota's like, I don't know what to do with residential, there will be a module. And it's not a 6 steps. It's something that, you know, not that the advocates, one particular stakeholder invented. It's something that is going to have wide sort of consensus use. So it is a tool to help move further for Patrick's mission to implement this law that at times feels like it's stalled over the 10 years. So.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Legenia Bailey. I'm a neuropharmacologist. I'm also a family member of 3 of my family members have schizophrenia. So I have a really intense question about experimental treatment exclusions. We know now that the RAISE study nationally reduces the trajectory of decline for folks with new onset schizophrenia, and that's an intensive treatment program with intense interventions. We also know that in the literature, sometimes medications that are, quote, not approved for an indication have a paradigm shifting, but it's not approved yet. It's new data that's come out and new trajectories for the outcomes of folks with serious SPMI. So my question is, this experimental treatment exclusion, what does that mean? And will patients and families get the treatment they need to change longitudinal outcomes with regard to functional decline versus saving money on the front end when there could actually be brain-saving techniques?
So I think that question, in the very, very limited time, I think they gave us 15 minutes here. We could have a whole session on that, and I would love to talk to you before we leave a little bit more about it. But just at a very macro level, exclusions of TMS, exclusions of residential treatment for eating disorder, not in the micro of the example you gave, but just large swaths of just well-known evidence-based treatment. When we're talking about if a plan were to exclude those, but similarly, on the medical side, you don't see exclusions for things like that nature. That's really what that NQTL is about, and what is the sort of decision-making points that a plan would have to evaluate. You know, there are experimental therapies on the medical surgical side that aren't covered. Certainly in the autism space, you know, things like chelation therapy. I mean, there's all kinds of lists that you can see, and those would be excluded and possibly based on these factors. And we just want to make sure that in the analysis that there's a balance there. But your question as to a specific therapy and a specific sort of macro view of what should be included when we're I can talk to you a little bit about at least how our scientific review committee would look at that. But
Yeah, I would just add again, to go into the parity analysis, by classification, as Tim mentioned, you have to look at, whether the criteria for determining that, let's say, a prescription drug is experimental, whether the criteria, the factors as written, i.e., looking at randomized controlled trials, looking at the pharmacopoeia, whatever the data source is that, informs a plan's decisions with respect to pharmaceuticals, just to focus on that example, are as written, comparable, and then in operation, there's that important aspect, and we don't have time this morning to get into really drill down on that, and I think that's still an area where we're trying to achieve more consensus. That how does it play out in operation? Obviously, in operation could mean a number of things. I think it means it includes decisions in the administration of benefits, approvals, denials, exceptions. I mean, every experimental treatment policy that I've seen has an exception policy. Now, how are those things administered? So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an answer.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Before I introduce the next speaker, I also want to just identify and acknowledge some of the other Kennedy Forum staff that are here today. David Lloyd, who's he's local. He was indispensable in putting together the program, so thank you wherever you are. There he is. And then I wanted to acknowledge Kara Kufta, who is the Kennedy Forum's Chief of Staff. She keeps all the trains running on time, so we're internally, she's in the background, we're indebted to her. And then there was a issue earlier about kind of legal case studies. Jessica Grillo, who's in the back of the room, raise your hand. She staffs the County Forum Legal Task Force, so she's available if you have any questions. And then Tori Keaton, to her left or to my right, is works with Tim on Parity Track, and then Amber McLaughlin, who is the communication specialist. So all of us are available as resources today, tomorrow, if you have any questions regarding anything. Obviously today, a lot of what we've done is just kind of scratch the surface in terms of these issues. But my next pleasure is to introduce another colleague, Kelly O'Brien, who's just played a tremendous role in terms of providing energy. And she's going to talk about, I think, which is very, very important, Parity Registry and consumer empowerment, especially as Victor and Julie have reminded us really why we're all here. So, Kelly.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks everybody for sticking around. For those of you who were here yesterday for this today, you know, when we put together the programming around justice, we thought obviously parity is at the heart of it, right? But we couldn't figure out how to do justice to this issue, and so we created a whole other day. So I'm really grateful to meet so many new people and see so many familiar faces, so thanks. You know, as I'm listening to all of this conversation today, and absorbing, I learn every single time from the experts, especially Tim and Gary and Henry. And I just keep thinking after listening to the Hootie story, sorry, I'll temp it better, okay. Honestly, families shouldn't have to know any of this. I don't want to know any of this. I mean, you should not have to learn this, right? I mean, we just want people, I want to get my care covered. I want to get my care covered and I want to get it paid for. And as someone who has to submit their claims by hand because my provider is out of network and doesn't submit claims and fight every month to get paid for what I already paid, like I get it, not remotely to the degree that you guys have had to struggle. But so many friends and family go through this every month. And I think the one important point about Parity Registry, and I know Patrick is going to take this thing home, but is that this is not a tool to help people learn about parity. It's hopefully a tool to help activate people, to provide an opportunity for them to express their complaints, and hopefully show that there is a demand out here for change and for reform. And so there are many tools on the site, I'm not going to go through them all, that do talk about some of the details and complaint letters and all of that. But I'm going to stick to some of the simplicity of it, and hopefully talk in a very high-level way from the perspective of somebody that understands, you know, what families and people have to go through to get paid, about some of the things that we might be able to do to help empower them to get the services that they need. So I also want to mention that this is a really, I'm very conscious that this is the brainchild and baby of Gary, and he's entrusted me and a good team of people to help bring it to life for consumers, but this was something that he saw right off the bat was something that we really needed. So I'm going to go directly, it's going to be hard to do this with the microphone in the, okay. Well, I want to get on the website though, so let me do that first. Because I want to show everybody how you can actually just log a complaint and what that does, like what happens when you do that. So let's say you go in for services. Your services are denied for whatever reason. I had a friend whose daughter was struggling. She attempted suicide a number of times. They went into Rosecrans for residential. After 3 days, the insurance company said, "Sorry, we don't cover inpatient. You're going to have to go home." You know, right? So what does that person do, right? So without having to learn anything about what is a you don't have to know if that's a parity complaint. You don't have to understand what the law says, but you're not getting covered. Your insurance company says, "Sorry, we're not going to do that." So one thing you can do as an advocate is to submit a complaint. If you go on the site, you can start a complaint. You just say, "I'm going to submit a complaint." Start a complaint. There's a number of questions here. All these are HIPAA compliant. So you answer a number of simple questions about what your circumstances are. So let's see if I do this for me. Currently employed. Let's do Illinois. or I'll provide name. And I'll have my email. Fields. No, I didn't get here. Good. Withdraw management. My plan excludes this coverage. Let's say, no, I haven't filed a complete. I'm just going to put help me. You can explain your circumstance. You don't need to do this. Submit. So now you have the opportunity, and this is by state. Already what that does is it logs a complaint. So for the Kennedy Forum's perspective, one of the things it does is it helps us track trends in the kind of circumstances that people are seeing and some of the challenges that we're having. So from a research and data perspective, that is one already very helpful thing. But to take it to the next level, you can actually, if I wanted to send this, and this is actually going to happen right now, so who's Brian from the department? You can go back and check the web. You're going to get an email in a second here. It's already, you'll see pre-populated the letter that I can send. It's just like sending a letter to your member of Congress. So it says, here's my issue. And you send that complaint, and it'll go directly now to the Attorney General's office and to the Department of Insurance in Illinois. Oh, it's not scrolling down for some reason here. Let me see if I can do this. I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah. There we go. No. Okay, at the bottom of that, you hit go, send. It sends a letter. So I've done this, we've tested it for every state. So I did it in Ohio. You get a nice note back from the Department of Insurance in Ohio, said your complaint has been received. So Amy, actually one thing that will be helpful is, here's the challenge with some of this. It's a baby step. This is a baby step. Our hope is that it helps people, it helps the Department of Insurance know that there are issues going on in the system. It helps people hopefully, the ideal circumstance would be the Department of Insurance gets this email, right? And they respond to the consumer, and then they can follow up and say, have you filed an appeal with your plan? Here are some of the steps that you need to go through. Here is, and provide some guidance about what some of those next steps are. The challenge with some of this is that as the issue brief, there's an issue brief in your packets that talks about the appeal process. It's inconsistent in every state. So if the Department of Insurance or the AG's office or whatever the regulatory authority's office is in the state does not have an email address, we can't submit this way. So for the Department of Labor, we can't actually send people to DOL because there's no way for them to directly submit a complaint. They have to actually, and there's a resource section on here to find this, but you actually have to go to the DOL website and submit that complaint directly online. So there are some exceptions to this, and the site does include resources about how you can do that in the case that your state doesn't have the ability to directly submit the complaint. But from an advocacy and consumer perspective, one of the things that I'd love to see happen is that, we heard last week at a hearing that our state legislature had that out of 8,000 complaints in the state of Illinois, only 37 of them were behavioral health complaints. I don't believe that. I think that, there's something going on here. We want to make sure that consumers are aware, families are aware that they can do this, that they can submit a complaint. But I also want to know on our end that that's happening, so that we can say, okay, we had 100 people last month submit a complaint to the Department of Insurance, and then I can call the Department of Insurance and say, I know you got 100 complaints. So what are we doing about this, right? And how do we activate people in the states to take action on their own behalf? So I know I'm talking quickly, we're a little over time. I would love to, there's so many things that the site does, but I wanted to really focus on the most simple thing, which is I really would hate to see an effort to, I've heard a lot of this from regulators that they don't, we don't get any complaints, there's no need, there's no problem, we don't hear from people, it's not an issue. Consumers are not the backstop to regulatory action. Like, they shouldn't have to force plans to be compliant. That's the job of regulators, right? But I do think there's an important role for consumers in the advocacy space. There's an important role for families who are struggling. And it helps us enforce the law. It helps regulators. It helps us hold people accountable. And so we hope that people will find some use to this. We would love to talk to, and we're working in phase 2 with experts like Remedy, who's here today, to figure out what is the best dissemination mechanism for this. How do we get this to providers? So when my friend who goes to Rosecrance and it gets denied for services, does she get a flyer that says, here's one thing you can do? Like, this isn't all of the solution, but one thing you can do is this. And we want to make sure that we're activating the advocacy community, but also provider community who can submit complaints on behalf of consumers as well, to know that this is available and to take good use of it so that there's at least some action step while we're trying to sort all of this other really complicated stuff out. So I'll stop there and just say thank you. I'm happy to answer questions in the back, but I want to give Patrick some time to close this baby out. If he's still around. Oh, same. Oh, great. Yeah.
Let me actually frame it. About 17 years ago, I was staffing Patrick's dad for a hearing on parity. And what he said was, it is an outrage that a person with a biochemical problem in the liver
Agreed. Yeah.
is treated with compassion, yet one with a biochemical problem in the brain is scorned. So Patrick talked about the inequity in funding, and he was talking about services and how we were able to approach, you can solve a problem, or at least fix it in part, by throwing money at it. So I did a little back of the envelope calculation, and it looks like National Cancer Institute and Arthritis and Infectious Disease get about $10.5 billion, whereas the 3 institutes involving mental health and addictions, plus a little bit of the Brain Project, get about 1/3 of that. Okay. Look at the strides that we've made in cancer as well. Look at the ability to make new targeted drugs. When's the last time we had a new therapy for a psychiatric problem? It's really been 20 years. Why? Because we don't have the money to find the targets. So I just wanted to instill that in people's minds, of the importance of treating mental health as a neuroscience issue and saying the brain is no different from the liver, except that it's more complex. So let's move forward in trying to use that as an advocacy tool and talk about brain disease.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for that presentation. Just a quick additional note. The information coming from Parity Registry is going to drive public policy debate going forward. The information we can extract from that on a de-identified basis is going to be absolutely critical for us to identify the next 10 years of public policy development and support in terms of trying to accomplish these goals. Before I turn it over to Patrick to wrap up, I did want to acknowledge Peter O'Brien and the County Forum Illinois for hosting us. Thank you very much. I wanted to also, yes. I also wanted to thank all the speakers. I really appreciate that. My suspicion is that the County Forum is going to do some more detailed programming later in the year, so stay tuned. Will give us the ability to do deeper dives for anybody who really wants to become a parity nerd. But let's turn it over to Patrick, who will end today's session with, I'm sure, some inspirational thoughts and stuff.
No more inspiration. Not allowed. I just want to thank everybody who participated. Thanks, Amy, for coming, and all who are here. This is really the ability for us to take your ideas and try to build a movement and sharpen its ability to make a difference through better advocacy and better tools for advocacy. So, really hope that your ideas and participation can help us propel what we're doing. And, we're doing it kind of by the seat of our pants, and I think we've done a pretty good job. I really have to say. And the exciting thing for this moment is that there's great alignment along all the major advocate organizations. I am, bless you, I'm happy to say I've had a long-term great relationship with all the major leaders of every single one of the principal major stakeholders in the mental health advocacy movement. And so while there is obviously going to be turf battles and personality clashes and the like, in this case, I really feel that we're in a moment in time where we really can all come together. Everybody's got sort of their own version of a unique agenda, but in I'd say 90+% of the time, we're all aligned on the basic, major, fundamental policy initiatives that we have to work on. But unfortunately, as an advocacy community, we've never kind of signed off on that as a unified AFL-CIO of mental health and addiction. We haven't gotten the groups to think about what are the big issues they've all got in common that we have to press for. Because the reason Congress gets to give us the Heisman every single session is it looks as though we don't really know what we want. And we're kind of all over the board with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and they don't know what really is that important. We need to do a better job of helping to focus on the structural things that are going to really make the biggest impact on the most people. And that's why focusing on things as technical and seemingly esoteric as parity NQTLs, as you all know, makes a big difference in terms of real people's lives. So take stock in the fact that you're part of something really, I think, that's going to make a difference in people's lives. And I thank you again, and let's keep on keeping on.